Welcome to all of you joining us today from around the world. What time is it where you're watching? Are you settling in for an evening watch from London? Perhaps it's your morning coffee time in New York, or maybe you're taking a midday, a break in Tokyo. And tell me, from which country are you tuning in? I'd love to know if we have viewers from Scotland itself, or if you're watching from Australia, Canada, India, or anywhere else on this beautiful planet of ours. Today, we're going to embark on a journey that will make you grateful for every modern convenience you take for granted. We're traveling back to medieval Scotland, a land where survival wasn't guaranteed from one day to the next, where a simple cut could mean death, and where the very act of being born was a roll of the dice with mortality itself. Picture this. You're a peasant farmer in 13th century Scotland. You wake up not to an alarm clock, but to the sound of your neighbour screaming as raiders torch his home. Your breakfast isn't cereal and milk, but a bowl of thin gruel made from whatever grain didn't rot in your damp storage pit. Your morning commute isn't a comfortable car ride, but a terrifying walk through forests where bandits wait to rob you of the few coins you've managed to scrape together. And your biggest worry isn't missing a meeting or paying bills. It's whether you'll live to see another sunrise. This is the reality we're diving into today. Medieval Scotland wasn't the romantic land of kilts and castles that Hollywood portrays. It was a nightmare of violence, disease, starvation, and suffering that would break the spirit of even the strongest modern person within days. By the time we're finished, you'll understand why historians call this period one of the most brutal chapters in human history. The year is 1250. Scotland is a land of approximately 400,000 souls, though that number fluctuates wildly as waves of disease, war, and famine sweep across the highlands and lowlands like the four horsemen of the apocalypse. The average life expectancy hovers around 25 years, and that's if you're lucky enough to survive childhood at all. Nearly half of all children born will die before their 5th birthday, victims of diseases that today we prevent with simple vaccines or cure with antibiotics that cost a few dollars. But let's start at the very beginning of life itself, because even being born in medieval Scotland was an act of incredible courage, or perhaps desperation. Imagine you're a woman in 13th century Scotland and you've just discovered you're pregnant. There's no ultrasound to check if your baby is healthy, no prenatal vitamins to ensure proper development, no sterile hospital waiting for your delivery. Instead, you face 9 months of terror, knowing that pregnancy is essentially a death sentence for 1 in every 10 women who attempt it. Your diet during pregnancy consists of whatever your family can scrounge together. If you're lucky, you might get some meat once or twice a week, usually the toughest, most gristle-filled cuts that even the dogs would turn their noses up at. Most days, you're living on bread so hard you have to soak it in water or weak ale just to make it chewable, supplemented by whatever vegetables haven't rotted in your family's meager stores. Vegetables, by the way, are nothing like what we know today. The carrots are white and bitter, about as appetizing as chewing on tree bark. The cabbage is tough and often crawling with insects. The onions are small and so sharp they could make you weep from across the room. And fresh fruit? That's a luxury reserved for the wealthy, available only during brief harvest seasons and quickly consumed before it spoils in an age without refrigeration. As your pregnancy progresses, you're expected to continue your backbreaking daily labor. There's no such thing as maternity leave when your family's survival depends on every pair of hands working from sunrise to sunset. You'll be out in the fields, bent over crops, your swelling belly making every movement agony. You'll be hauling water from distant wells, the weight of the bucket straining your already aching back. You'll be tending to livestock, knowing that a kick from a horse or a gore from a bull could end both your life and your unborn child's in an instant. When labor finally begins, there's no rush to a sterile hospital room. Instead, you're confined, to your family's single-room dwelling, a structure that's barely more than a hut. The walls are made of rough stone, chinked with mud and moss, constantly damp and mouldy. The floor is nothing but packed earth, soaked with years of spilled food, animal waste and human fluids. The air is thick with smoke from the central fire pit, since there's no chimney, just a hole in the roof that lets out some of the smoke while letting in rain, snow and cold air. Your midwife, if you're fortunate enough to have one, learned her trade not through medical school, but through trial and error, watching other women live and die in childbirth. Her tools are whatever she can find, perhaps a rusty knife to cut the umbilical cord, rags that may or may not be clean to help with the bleeding, and a collection of herbs and potions that are just as likely to poison you as help you. The birthing process itself is a horror that defies description. There's no anesthesia, no pain medication, no sterile environment. You're giving birth on a straw mattress that's probably crawling with fleas, lice, and other parasites. The room reeks of unwashed bodies, animal waste from the livestock that share your living space, and the metallic smell of blood that will soon be flowing freely. If complications arise during labor, and they frequently do, there's no emergency. Cesarean section to save you and your baby. If the baby is breech, stuck, or too large, both of you will likely die in prolonged agony. If you hemorrhage after birth, there's no blood transfusion waiting. If infection sets in, which it often does in these unsanitary conditions, there are no antibiotics to fight it off. Let's say, by some miracle, both you and your baby survive the birth itself. Your ordeal is far from over. In fact, it's just beginning. Your newborn infant enters a world that seems designed to kill children as quickly as possible. That first breath your baby takes is filled with smoke from the ever-burning fire, particulates from the dirt floor that gets kicked up constantly, and the bacteria-laden air of a room that houses humans and animals together. The baby's first meal comes from a mother who is malnourished, exhausted, and likely suffering from any number of diseases and deficiencies. Keeping a baby clean is nearly impossible when clean water is a precious commodity that must be hauled from distant sources. You'll be lucky to bathe your infant once a week, and that's with water that's already been used for cooking, cleaning, and other household tasks. The concept of sterilization doesn't exist. Everything the baby touches, from blankets to feeding implements, is contaminated with bacteria that would horrify a modern parent. The baby's clothing, if you can call it that, consists of rough cloth strips that chafe delicate skin and are changed infrequently due to the scarcity of textiles. Diaper rash isn't just an inconvenience. It's a gateway for serious infections that can kill a child within days. The baby sleeps not in a safe crib, but in whatever makeshift bed you can create, often sharing space with siblings, parents, and sometimes even small livestock for warmth. Feeding presents its own set of deadly challenges. If breastfeeding fails, which it often does when mothers are malnourished and stressed, there's no formula waiting on store shelves. Instead, babies are fed whatever liquid the family can find. Watered-down cow's milk if they're lucky, then gruel if they're not, and sometimes even ale because it's safer than the available water. These substitutes lack the nutrients growing babies need and are often contaminated with bacteria that cause violent diarrhea and dehydration. The diseases that stalk medieval Scottish children are legion and merciless. Smallpox sweeps through communities like wildfire, leaving survivors scarred and often blind. Measles kills 1 child in 4 who contracts it. Whooping cough suffocates infants in their sleep. Dysentery turns a baby's digestive system into a battlefield, leading to dehydration and death within days. But perhaps the most insidious killer is simple malnutrition. Children who survive infancy often do so as stunted, weakened versions of what they could have been. Their growth is stunted, their minds develop slowly, and their bodies lack the strength to fight off the constant barrage of diseases that medieval life throws at them. If a child manages to survive to the age of 5, and remember, nearly half don't, they've essentially won the lottery of medieval existence. But their prize isn't a life of ease and safety. Instead, it's the privilege of facing the next set of challenges that medieval Scotland has waiting. Child labour isn't a social problem to be solved in medieval Scotland. It's an economic necessity that determines whether families live or starve. By age 6, children are expected to contribute meaningfully to household survival. This isn't helping with simple chores like setting the table or feeding a pet. This is dangerous, back-breaking work that would be considered criminal child abuse. In any modern society, young children work in the fields from dawn to dusk, their small hands bleeding from handling rough tools and thorny plants. They tend livestock that can easily kill them with a kick or a bite. They fetch water from wells and streams where a single misstep means drowning. They help with food preparation, using sharp knives and working around open fires that can easily ignite their crude clothing. Girls as young as 7 are expected to spin wool and weave cloth, their fingers cramping and bleeding from the constant repetitive motion. They help with cooking over open fires, constantly at risk of severe burns. They assist with childbirth and care for sick family members, exposing themselves to deadly diseases. And as they reach their early teens, they face the terrifying prospect of marriage and childbirth themselves, often to men they've never met and who are decades older. Boys face their own nightmarish challenges. They're apprenticed to trades that are incredibly dangerous. Blacksmithing, where molten metal can blind or kill. Carpentry, where a slip of a tool can sever fingers or worse. And farming, where heavy machinery and unpredictable animals pose constant threats. Military training begins early, not with toy swords and games, but with real weapons and the expectation that they'll soon be using them to kill or be killed. The education system, such as it exists, is reserved for the wealthy elite and focuses primarily on warfare, basic literacy for the nobility, and religious instruction. The vast majority of Scottish children grow up completely illiterate, unable to read even the simplest texts. This isn't just an inconvenience. It's a death sentence in a world where written instructions for medicine, trade agreements, and legal protections could mean the difference between prosperity and destruction. Religious education, when available, focuses heavily on the concept of suffering as a path to salvation, essentially teaching children that their miserable existence is divinely ordained and that questioning it is sinful. Children learn that they're born into sin, that life is supposed to be difficult, and that their only hope is death and the promise of a better afterlife. As children grow into teenagers, they face some of the most brutal realities of medieval Scottish life. For girls, this means the onset of menstruation in a world without sanitary products, pain relief, or even basic understanding of reproductive health. They use rags that are rarely clean, suffer through debilitating cramps without medication, and face the constant fear of pregnancy that could kill them. Marriage for girls typically happens between ages 12 and 16, not based on love or compatibility, but as economic and political arrangements between families. A girl has no say in who she marries, when she marries, or how she's treated by her husband. She becomes essentially property, traded like livestock to cement alliances, settle debts, or gain access to land and resources. The wedding night for these young girls is often their first introduction to sexual violence, sanctioned by both church and state. There's no concept of consent, no understanding of emotional or physical readiness, and no recourse if their husband is abusive. Pregnancy follows quickly and often repeatedly, with many women facing continuous cycles of pregnancy, childbirth, and nursing until their bodies simply can't take any more. For boys, adolescence means preparation for violence. By age 14, they're expected to be competent with weapons and ready to defend their families and communities. Military training is brutal and often deadly. Practice with real swords leads to serious injuries and deaths even during peacetime. Boys learn to fight not through controlled sports, but through actual combat that frequently results in permanent disability or death. The concept of adolescent rebellion doesn't exist when questioning authority can result in immediate and severe punishment. Young people who challenge their parents, local lords, or religious authorities face beatings, public humiliation, exile, or even execution. The modern idea of teenagers exploring their identity and pushing boundaries is replaced by absolute submission to authority or violent consequences. But let's move beyond childhood and examine what daily life looks like for adults in medieval Scotland, because that's where the true brutality of this existence becomes clear. Wake up in medieval Scotland, and your first sensation isn't the gentle chime of an alarm clock or the warm comfort of a heated home. It's the shocking cold that penetrates your bones, even in summer, because your dwelling has no insulation. And the single fire that provides heat went out during the night. Your bed isn't a comfortable mattress with clean sheets. It's a pile of straw that's probably moldy, definitely flea-infested, and shared with your entire family, plus any small animals you keep for warmth. Your first task of the day isn't brushing your teeth or taking a shower. Dental hygiene consists of rubbing your teeth with a rough cloth if you're lucky, or simply rinsing your mouth with whatever liquid is available. Most adults have lost several teeth by age 30, and those remaining are usually black, broken, or causing constant pain. There's no toothpaste, no pain relief for dental agony, and no dentist to fix problems. When a tooth becomes unbearably painful, your only option is having it yanked out by whoever has the strongest grip and the most experience with pliers. Bathing is a luxury that most people indulge in perhaps once a month if they're particularly fastidious. The rest of the time, you live with the accumulation of dirt, sweat, and body odors that would be unbearable to modern sensibilities. Your clothes are made of rough wool or linen that chafes your skin and holds odors like a sponge. You might own 2 sets of clothing if you're prosperous, one to wear while the other is being cleaned, which happens infrequently and without effective soap. Your breakfast, if you can call it that, might consist of bread so stale and hard you have to soak it in ale or water to make it edible. The bread itself is made from grain that's often partially spoiled, giving it a bitter taste and sometimes containing ergot fungus that can cause hallucinations, seizures, and death. If you're having a good day, you might add some cheese that's more mold than dairy, or eggs from chickens that are probably diseased. Leaving your home means stepping into a world that assaults your senses with its filth and danger. The streets, such as they are, consist of packed earth mixed with human and animal waste, rotting food scraps, and the occasional human corpse that hasn't been removed yet. During rainy periods, these streets become rivers of liquid filth that can rise to ankle deep, carrying diseases and parasites that enter through any small cut or scratch on your feet. The smell is indescribable to modern sensibilities. Imagine the worst public bathroom you've ever encountered. Multiply that by 100, add the stench of rotting meat, unwashed bodies, industrial waste, and death, and you're beginning to approach what medieval Scottish towns smell like on an average day. Every step outside your door is potentially your last. Bandits and raiders regularly sweep through settlements, killing indiscriminately and taking whatever they can carry. Scottish clan warfare means that simply living in the wrong area or bearing the wrong family name can make you a target for violence. English invasions bring armies that rape, pillage, and burn their way across the countryside. But even without external threats, Simply living in medieval Scotland is like playing Russian roulette with multiple loaded chambers. Food poisoning from spoiled meat or contaminated grain can kill you within days. Cuts and scrapes that would be minor inconveniences today become infected and lead to gangrene, amputation, or death. Diseases spread like wildfire through populations that have no understanding of contagion or hygiene. Let's talk about food, because sustenance in medieval Scotland bears no resemblance to the abundance we know today. The average person's diet consists primarily of bread, ale, and whatever vegetables can be coaxed from the harsh Scottish soil. Meat is a luxury reserved for special occasions, or the wealthy, and when it is available, it's usually the parts of animals that we'd consider inedible today, organs, fatty scraps, and cuts so tough they require hours of cooking to become somewhat chewable. The bread that forms the cornerstone of most meals is made from whatever grain is available, often mixed with sawdust or other fillers to make it stretch further. During bad harvests, desperate families grind bark, acorns, and even clay into their flour to create something resembling food. The resulting bread is dense, bitter, and often causes digestive problems that can be fatal. Ale isn't consumed for pleasure. It's often safer to drink than the available water, which is contaminated with human waste, animal carcasses, and industrial runoff from primitive manufacturing. Even children drink ale regularly because the fermentation process kills some of the bacteria that would otherwise cause deadly dysentery and cholera. Preserving food without refrigeration means that most of what people eat is either dried to the point of being nearly inedible, salted until it's almost toxic, or smoked until it tastes more like charcoal than meat. Fresh fruits and vegetables are available only during brief harvest seasons and must be consumed immediately or they'll rot. This means that for most of the year, people suffer from scurvy, rickets, and other diseases caused by vitamin deficiencies. Cooking methods are primitive and dangerous. All food preparation happens over open fires that can easily ignite clothing, hair, or the dwelling itself. There are no temperature controls, no timers, and no safety equipment. Burns from cooking fires are incredibly common and often fatal due to infection. Storage of food presents its own challenges. Granaries are constantly under attack from rats, mice, and insects that consume and contaminate supplies. Root cellars flood regularly, ruining stored vegetables. Smokehouses require constant attention to prevent fires while maintaining the smoking process that preserves meat. But perhaps the most terrifying aspect of food in medieval Scotland is its unreliability. Crop failures due to weather, disease, or warfare mean that entire populations can face starvation with little warning. When harvests fail, people begin eating grass, leather, and anything else they can get down their throats. Cannibalism during severe famines is documented in historical records, showing just how desperate survival could become. The concept of 3 meals a day is a modern luxury. Most medieval Scots eat when they can find food, sometimes going days without substantial nutrition. Children develop the swollen bellies characteristic of malnutrition. Adults waste away until their skeletal figures barely able to work. And when death from starvation comes, it's a slow, agonizing process that can take weeks. Now let's examine the diseases that stalk medieval Scotland like invisible demons, killing without warning and spreading through populations that have no understanding of how contagion works. The Black Death, bubonic plague, arrives in Scotland in the 14th century like an apocalyptic nightmare. Within months, entire towns are wiped out. The disease begins with fever and chills, progresses to agonizing swollen lymph nodes that can grow to the size of apples, and ends with internal bleeding that causes victims to vomit blood before dying in excruciating pain. There's no cure, no treatment, and no understanding of how it spreads. Victims of the plague are often abandoned by their own families, left to die alone because people correctly sense that the disease is contagious but don't understand how. Bodies pile up in the streets because there aren't enough living people to bury the dead. Mass graves become common as entire communities struggle to dispose of corpses before they create even more disease. But the plague is just one of many diseases that terrorize medieval Scotland. Smallpox creates pustules that cover victims from head to toe, often leaving survivors blind and horribly scarred. Measles kills children and adults alike, causing high fevers, painful rashes, and often fatal complications. Whooping cough suffocates its victims slowly, causing weeks of violent coughing that can break ribs and rupture blood vessels. Dysentery, caused by contaminated water and poor sanitation, turns the digestive system into a battlefield. Victims suffer bloody diarrhea that quickly leads to dehydration and death. Typhus, spread by lice that infest everyone's clothing and bedding, causes high fever, severe headaches, and a distinctive rash that often signals impending death. Tuberculosis consumes its victims slowly, causing them to waste away over months or years while coughing up blood and struggling to breathe. There's no treatment, so families watch helplessly as loved ones deteriorate before their eyes. The disease spreads easily in the cramped, poorly ventilated living conditions that most people endure. Leprosy, while less common, creates some of the most horrifying suffering imaginable. Victims slowly lose sensation in their extremities, leading to injuries that they can't feel and that become infected. Fingers and toes rot away. Facial features become distorted, and society treats lepers as walking corpses, forcing them to live in isolation and announce their presence with bells so others can avoid them. Sexually transmitted diseases spread rapidly through populations that have no understanding of sexual health or hygiene. Syphilis, when it appears, causes painful sores, mental deterioration, and eventual death. Gonorrhea leads to infertility and chronic pain. These diseases are seen as divine punishment for moral failings rather than medical conditions requiring treatment. Mental illness in medieval Scotland is treated as demonic possession or divine punishment. People suffering from depression, anxiety, schizophrenia, or other conditions are often chained, beaten, or subjected to crude exorcisms. There's no understanding of brain chemistry, psychological trauma, or effective treatments. Many mentally ill individuals are simply abandoned or killed as threats to community safety. Medical treatment, such as it exists, is more likely to kill patients than cure them. Physicians, when available, rely on the theory of humours, the belief that illness is caused by imbalances in bodily fluids. Treatments include bloodletting, which weakens already sick patients, purging with toxic substances that cause violent vomiting and diarrhea, and the application of leeches that often introduce additional infections. Surgery is performed without anesthesia, antiseptics, or understanding of anatomy. Patients are held down while surgeons use crude, unsterilized tools to cut into living flesh. The mortality rate for surgical procedures approaches 100%, with most patients dying from shock, blood loss, or infection within days of the operation. Women's health issues are particularly poorly understood and treated. Childbirth complications are seen as God's will rather than medical emergencies. Menstrual problems are considered shameful and often treated with dangerous herbal concoctions. Reproductive health is shrouded in superstition and ignorance that leads to unnecessary suffering and death. The psychological impact of living in constant fear of disease cannot be overstated. People wake up each day knowing that a slight fever could be the beginning of their death sentence. They watch family members die horrible deaths while being powerless to help. They live with the constant anxiety that comes from not understanding why people get sick or how to prevent it. This brings us to one of the most defining characteristics of medieval Scottish life: violence. Not just the occasional conflict or crime that we might experience today, but violence as a constant, overwhelming presence that shapes every aspect of existence. Warfare in medieval Scotland isn't the romanticized battle between noble knights that we see in movies. It's brutal, chaotic slaughter where victory goes to whoever can kill the most people in the most efficient manner. Scottish clan conflicts can erupt over the smallest disputes, a perceived insult, a boundary disagreement, or competition for resources, and escalate into blood feuds that last for generations. When clans go to war, there are no rules of engagement, no protection for civilians, and no mercy for the defeated. Warriors use whatever weapons they can find: swords, axes, spears, clubs, rocks, and their bare hands. Combat is close, personal, and incredibly violent. Men literally hack each other to pieces, with battles continuing until one side is completely destroyed or flees in terror. The weapons themselves are designed to inflict maximum damage and suffering. Swords aren't the elegant rapiers of later periods. They're heavy, crude instruments meant for chopping rather than thrusting. A single sword blow can sever limbs, split skulls, or disembowel opponents. Axes cleave through bone and flesh with devastating effect. Spears punch through armor and organs, often leaving victims to die slowly from internal bleeding. But perhaps more terrifying than the weapons are the tactics used in medieval Scottish warfare. Armies regularly employ siege warfare that involves starving entire populations into submission. During sieges, defenders watch helplessly as their food supplies dwindle, their water becomes contaminated, and disease spreads through their cramped fortifications. When castles finally fall, the victorious army typically massacres everyone inside, regardless of age or gender. Raiding is a constant threat that keeps entire populations living in fear. War bands sweep down from the highlands or across the borders, burning crops, stealing livestock, and killing anyone who resists. These raids aren't just military operations, they're economic strategies designed to destroy enemies' ability to survive. Raiders specifically target food stores, breeding animals, and seed grain, ensuring that their victims will face starvation even if they survive the immediate attack. The treatment of prisoners of war reveals the depths of medieval brutality. Captured enemies aren't held in comfortable prisoner-of-war camps. They're tortured for information, enslaved, or killed in ways designed to terrorize other potential enemies. Public executions are elaborate affairs where victims are burned, alive, drawn and quartered, or subjected to other forms of death that can take hours to complete. Women and children aren't spared from the violence of warfare. Rape is considered a legitimate spoil of war, with victorious soldiers viewing enemy women as property to be claimed and used. Children are killed to prevent them from growing up to seek revenge, or enslaved to work for their parents' killers. Entire family lines can be wiped out in a single battle or raid. But warfare isn't the only source of violence in medieval Scotland. Criminal justice is based entirely on physical punishment and public terror. Theft, even of small items, can result in having hands cut off. Adultery might be punished by public flogging or mutilation. Murder leads to execution, but not the relatively quick methods we know today. Criminals are hanged slowly, beheaded with dull axes that require multiple blows, or burned alive while crowds cheer. The justice system itself is corrupt and biased toward the powerful. Nobles can literally get away with murder if their victims are peasants, while common people face severe punishment for minor offenses against their social superiors. Trials, when they occur at all, are often based on superstition rather than evidence. Accused criminals might be forced to undergo trial by ordeal, carrying red-hot iron, being thrown into water to see if they float like witches, or fighting their accusers in combat. Domestic violence is not only legal, but expected in medieval Scotland. Husbands have the legal right to beat their wives for any perceived disobedience, and wives have no recourse or protection. Children are regularly beaten for minor infractions, with physical discipline that would be considered severe abuse today, being viewed as necessary parenting. Public violence is a form of entertainment in medieval Scotland. Executions draw crowds who cheer and jeer at the condemned. Public floggings are social events where entire communities gather to watch criminals being whipped until they pass out from pain. Bear baiting, dog fighting, and other forms of animal cruelty are popular pastimes that satisfy the population's appetite for bloodshed. The psychological impact of living surrounded by such violence is devastating. People develop a casual acceptance of brutality that would horrify modern sensibilities. Children grow up witnessing torture and murder as normal parts of life. Adults carry weapons constantly because they know that any interaction could suddenly turn lethal. This constant exposure to violence creates a society where life has very little value. People die over minor disputes that would be settled with words in modern times. Feuds escalate quickly because everyone is armed and ready to fight. The concept of peaceful conflict resolution is virtually unknown because violence is the default solution to every problem. Now let's examine the economic realities of medieval Scottish life, because poverty in this era reaches levels that are difficult for modern people to comprehend. The vast majority of medieval Scots are peasants who own essentially nothing. They don't own their land, their homes, their tools, or even themselves in many cases. Everything they use belongs to local lords who can take it away at any time for any reason. This isn't just economic inequality, it's economic slavery that traps families in cycles of poverty that last for generations. A typical peasant family lives in a single-room dwelling that they share with their livestock. The animals aren't kept separately for sanitary reasons. They're brought inside for warmth and protection, meaning that families live in constant contact with animal waste, disease, and parasites. The smell alone would be unbearable to modern people, but medieval Scots have no choice but to endure it. Work begins before dawn and continues until after dark, 7 days a week, with no concept of weekends, vacations, or sick leave. Peasants work their lord's land first, then their own small plots if time permits. During planting and harvest seasons, they might work 18-hour days in back-breaking labor that would challenge modern athletes. The tools available for this work are primitive and ineffective. Ploughs are crude wooden implements that barely scratch the surface of hard Scottish soil. Sickles for harvesting grain are dull and require enormous effort to cut through crops. Everything must be done by hand, from clearing rocks to hauling water, to processing grain into flour. Payment for this exhausting labor comes not in money, which most peasants rarely see, but in a portion of whatever they produce. However, after paying taxes to the king, tithes to the church, rent to their lord, and fees for using mills and other equipment, peasant families are left with barely enough to survive. One bad harvest means starvation, and there's no social safety net to help struggling families. The feudal system ensures that peasants can never improve their situation through hard work or clever thinking. They're legally bound to the land, meaning they can't leave to seek better opportunities elsewhere. They can't learn trades that might be more profitable. They can't accumulate wealth because anything they save can be confiscated by their lord. They're trapped in poverty by law, custom, and the sword. Clothing reflects this desperate poverty. Most people own only what they're wearing, plus perhaps one change of garments. Clothes are made from the roughest, cheapest materials available, and are patched and repatched until they're more patches than original fabric. Shoes are luxury items that many peasants can't afford, meaning they work barefoot even in winter, leading to frostbite, cuts, and infections. Housing consists of structures that would be condemned as uninhabitable by modern standards. Walls are made of stacked stones with mud and moss filling the gaps, providing minimal protection from Scottish weather. Roofs are thatched with straw that leaks constantly and provides homes for countless insects and rodents. Floors are bare earth that becomes muddy when it rains and dusty when it's dry. Furniture is virtually non-existent in peasant homes. Families sit on the ground, sleep on piles of straw, and eat from crude wooden bowls using their hands. There are no chairs, tables, beds, or storage containers beyond simple baskets and clay pots. Privacy doesn't exist when entire families share single rooms with no internal walls or separate spaces. The economic system ensures that wealth flows upward from those who do the work to those who own the land and weapons. Peasants produce food, but nobles eat the best of it. Peasants build castles and manor houses, but live in hovels themselves. Peasants craft goods and materials, but can't afford to buy what they make. Trade and commerce exist primarily for the benefit of the wealthy. Markets, when they occur, are controlled by guilds and nobles who take large percentages of any profits. Common people have little to trade and even less money to spend. Most economic activity happens through barter systems where people trade labor, food, and goods directly rather than using currency. Banking doesn't exist for common people, meaning they can't save money safely, get loans to improve their situations, or invest in better tools or opportunities. Any wealth they do accumulate must be hidden, and even then, it can be confiscated by authorities at any time. The concept of economic mobility, working your way up from poverty to prosperity, is virtually impossible. Taxes are crushing burdens that take large percentages of whatever peasants produce. These taxes support the military campaigns of nobles, the luxurious lifestyles of the wealthy, and the massive stone churches and castles that dot the Scottish landscape. Peasants pay for the very systems that keep them oppressed. The church demands its own taxes in the form of tithes, typically 10% of everything a family produces. This isn't optional charity, but mandatory payment backed by the threat of excommunication and eternal damnation. Peasants watch their children go hungry while their grain goes to feed wealthy clergy who live in comfort. Economic disasters are common and devastating. A single hailstorm can destroy an entire year's crops, plunging families into starvation. Disease that kills livestock can eliminate a family's primary source of wealth. Warfare that destroys fields and storage buildings can create famines that last for years. When economic disaster strikes, there's no government assistance, no insurance, and no social programs to help struggling families. People simply starve, freeze, or die of diseases brought on by malnutrition and exposure. Survivors might become beggars, bandits, or slaves, assuming they can find anyone willing to feed a slave. The psychological impact of this grinding poverty is devastating. People live in constant anxiety about their next meal, their next payment to their lord, and their ability to survive the next crisis. Hope for a better future is virtually non-existent when the system is designed to keep them trapped in poverty forever. Children grow up knowing they'll face the same grinding poverty as their parents, with no education, opportunities, or possibility of improvement. This creates a fatalistic worldview where people accept suffering as their natural state and resist any efforts to change their circumstances. The contrast between rich and poor in medieval Scotland is stark beyond modern comprehension. While peasants starve in hovels, nobles feast in heated stone castles. While common people wear rags, the wealthy dress in fine cloth and furs. While families share single rooms with their animals, lords live in elaborate structures with dozens of rooms and hundreds of servants. This inequality isn't seen as a social problem to be solved, but as a natural order ordained by God. The Church teaches that poverty is a virtue that leads to salvation, while wealth is a sign of divine favor. This religious justification makes it almost impossible for people to question the system that oppresses them. Let's delve deeper into the role of religion in medieval Scotland, because the church doesn't just influence daily life, it controls and terrorizes the population with threats of eternal damnation for the smallest infractions. The Catholic Church in medieval Scotland wields absolute power over the minds and souls of the population. Every aspect of life is governed by religious doctrine interpreted by priests who claim to speak directly for God. Question the Church's teachings, and you're not just disagreeing with human authority, you're rebelling against the divine will of the Creator himself. Sunday isn't a day of rest and peaceful reflection as we might imagine. It's a day of mandatory attendance at services conducted in Latin that the vast majority of the population can't understand. Peasants who are exhausted from 6 days of backbreaking labor must drag themselves to cold, damp stone churches where they stand for hours, listening to sermons about their inherent sinfulness and the punishments awaiting them in the afterlife. The sermons themselves are exercises in psychological torture, designed to keep the population submissive and terrified. Priests describe in graphic detail the torments of hell that await anyone who disobeys church doctrine. They speak of eternal fires that burn without consuming, of demons that tear flesh from bones for all eternity, of unending screams and agony for those who commit even minor sins. But the sins that lead to damnation aren't just major crimes like murder or theft. Medieval church doctrine holds that virtually everything pleasurable or natural is sinful. Sexual desire, even between married couples, is viewed with suspicion. Laughter and joy are discouraged as signs of spiritual weakness. Questioning authority is rebellion against God's chosen representatives. Even thoughts and desires that are never acted upon can condemn souls to eternal torment. The concept of purgatory adds another layer of terror to medieval religious life. Even if you avoid the worst sins that lead directly to hell, you'll still likely spend thousands of years in purgatory being tortured for minor infractions before you're purified enough for heaven. The Church teaches that these torments can be reduced through payments, prayers, and good works, but only if you follow church instructions exactly and contribute generously to religious causes. Confession becomes a weekly exercise in humiliation and fear. Peasants must reveal their most private thoughts and actions to priests who often use this information to control and manipulate them. The penance assigned for sins often involves physical punishment, public humiliation, or payments that struggling families can barely afford. Religious festivals, rather than being celebrations, become displays of fanatical devotion that often turn violent. Processions where people whip themselves until they bleed are considered acts of holy devotion. Religious plays depicting the tortures of hell traumatize children and adults alike. Saints' feast days become occasions for extreme fasting that can damage health or even cause death. The Church's control extends into every aspect of daily life through an elaborate system of religious laws and regulations. What you eat, when you eat it, how you dress, who you can marry, how you can behave in your own home, all are governed by religious doctrine enforced with threats of eternal punishment. Marriage is controlled entirely by the Church, which views it primarily as a necessary evil for procreation, rather than a relationship based on love or compatibility. Couples must receive church permission to marry, pay fees they often can't afford, and submit to religious instruction about their duties to each other and to God. Divorce is virtually impossible, trapping people in abusive or miserable relationships. For life, the Church's attitude toward women is particularly oppressive. Women are viewed as inherently sinful daughters of Eve, who led mankind into damnation. They're considered weak, irrational, and susceptible to demonic influence. Their primary purpose is seen as bearing children and serving their husbands in complete submission. Any woman who shows intelligence, independence, or leadership qualities is suspected of witchcraft. Speaking of witchcraft, the persecution of Supposed witches becomes one of the most horrifying aspects of medieval religious life. Women who practice herbal medicine, midwifery, or who simply act in ways that challenge male authority can be accused of consorting with Satan. The trials for witchcraft are brutal affairs where confession is extracted through torture, and conviction usually leads to being burned alive. The methods used to identify witches reveal the depth of religious paranoia and superstition. Women are thrown into water. If they float, they're witches who should be executed. If they sink and drown, they were innocent. They're subjected to trials by ordeal, where they must carry red-hot iron or plunge their hands into boiling water. Survival is considered proof of supernatural protection and therefore evidence of witchcraft. Torture devices used in these religious trials are designed to inflict maximum pain while keeping victims alive long enough to confess. The rack stretches bodies until joints separate. Thumbscrews crush fingers until bones break. The strappado dislocates shoulders and arms. Iron maidens pierce flesh with dozens of spikes. All of this is done in the name of saving souls and protecting Christian communities from evil. The Church also controls education, ensuring that literacy remains limited to clergy and nobles while keeping the masses ignorant and dependent on religious authority for interpretation of God's will. What little education exists focuses primarily on religious doctrine rather than practical skills or critical thinking. Independent thought is discouraged as dangerous pride that leads to damnation. Religious art and architecture in medieval Scotland reflects this obsession with suffering and death. Churches are filled with images of crucifixion, martyrdom, and the torments of hell. Gargoyles and demons leer from walls and doorways. Paintings depict saints being tortured in elaborate ways, supposedly inspiring viewers to accept their own suffering as holy devotion. The economic burden of supporting the Church adds another layer of hardship to already struggling families. Tithes take 10% of everything they produce, but additional fees are required for baptisms, marriages, funerals, and religious festivals. The Church accumulates vast wealth while preaching that poverty is a virtue and that the poor should be grateful for their suffering. Religious holidays, rather than providing relief from daily hardships, often require additional work and expense that families can't afford. Special foods must be prepared, new clothes purchased if possible, and contributions made to the Church. Failure to participate fully in religious observances marks families as suspect and potentially heretical. The psychological impact of living under such religious oppression is devastating. People develop intense anxiety about their spiritual state, constantly worried that they've committed sins that will damn them forever. Children grow up terrified of hell, taught that they're inherently evil and that only complete submission to church authority might save them. This religious terror serves the political purposes of both church and state by keeping the population submissive and hopeless. People who believe their suffering is divinely ordained are less likely to rebel against earthly authorities. Those who expect rewards only in the afterlife won't demand better treatment in this life. Now, let's examine what happens when people in medieval Scotland get sick or injured, because the medical practices of this era are often more terrifying than the diseases they're supposed to treat. Medieval Scottish medicine is based primarily on superstition, religious doctrine, and theories that have no basis in reality. The dominant medical theory revolves around the four humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, which supposedly must be kept in perfect balance for health. When someone gets sick, physicians assume that these humours are out of balance and attempt to correct the problem through treatments that are usually more harmful than the original illness. Bloodletting is the most common medical treatment, based on the belief that most illnesses are caused by having too much blood in the body. Physicians use crude knives, leeches, or primitive cupping devices to drain blood from patients who are often already weakened by disease. The amount of blood removed would shock modern medical professionals, sometimes several pints from patients, who can't afford to lose any blood at all. The tools used for bloodletting are rarely clean and are often shared between patients, spreading diseases far more effectively than curing them. Knives used to open veins are the same ones used for other purposes and carry bacteria from previous uses. Leeches are reused multiple times and can transfer infections from one patient to another. Cupping devices that create suction to draw blood are made of materials that can't be properly sterilized. Purging is another common treatment that involves forcing patients to vomit violently or suffer through explosive diarrhea. Physicians administer toxic substances like mercury, antimony, or various plant extracts that cause the body to expel its contents through both ends simultaneously. Patients often die from dehydration, electrolyte imbalances, or poisoning from the purging agents themselves. Surgery, when attempted, is a horrifying experience that most patients don't survive. There's no anesthesia beyond alcohol or opium-based preparations that are rarely available and not very effective. Patients are held down by assistants while surgeons cut into living flesh with crude, unsterilized instruments. The pain is so intense that many patients die from shock before the surgery is completed. Surgical instruments are primitive and often improvised from household tools. Knives used for surgery might be the same ones used to slaughter animals or prepare food. Saws for amputations are crude implements that crush and tear as much as they cut. Needles for sewing wounds are thick, rough implements that cause additional trauma to damaged tissue. The concept of sterility doesn't exist in medieval medicine. Surgeons don't wash their hands, instruments aren't cleaned between patients, and surgical sites are often contaminated with dirt, animal waste, and other sources of infection. Wounds are dressed with rags that may have been used for other purposes and are almost certainly contaminated with bacteria. Amputation is a common surgical procedure, not because it's medically necessary, but because physicians don't know how to treat infections, fractures, or other injuries that could be healed with proper care. Arms and legs are sawed off with crude instruments while patients scream in agony. Most amputation patients die within days from blood loss, shock, or infection. The size treatment of broken bones reveals the primitive nature of medieval medicine. Fractures are often set incorrectly, leading to permanent deformity and disability. Splints are made from whatever materials are available, often dirty wood or cloth that introduces infection. Complex fractures that could be repaired today are treated with amputation or simply left to heal improperly. Pain management consists primarily of alcohol, opium when available, or herbal preparations that have minimal effectiveness. Most patients must endure medical procedures with no pain relief whatsoever. The screams of surgical patients can be heard throughout medieval towns, adding to the general atmosphere of suffering and terror. Medical education, such as it exists, is based on ancient texts that are often copied incorrectly and contain information that was never accurate to begin with. Physicians learn their trade not through careful observation and experimentation, but by memorizing outdated theories and applying them regardless of results. There's no concept of evidence-based medicine or learning from experience. The treatment of mental illness is particularly brutal and ignorant. Patients suffering from depression, anxiety, or other psychological conditions are assumed to be possessed by demons or punished by God for their sins. Treatments include exorcism, beating, chaining, starvation, and exposure to extreme temperatures. Many mentally ill individuals are simply abandoned or killed as threats to community safety. Obstetrics and gynecology are especially dangerous fields where ignorance and superstition combine to create deadly outcomes. Midwives learn their trade through trial and error, with no understanding of anatomy, sterile technique, or emergency procedures. Complicated births that could be managed safely today often result in the deaths of both mother and child. The instruments used in childbirth are crude and dangerous. Forceps, when available, are rough metal implements that can crush infant skulls or tear maternal tissue. Procedures to turn breech babies are performed without anesthesia and often result in severe internal injuries. Caesarean sections are attempted only when the mother is already dead or dying, and infant survival rates are essentially zero. Postpartum care is minimal and often harmful. New mothers are confined to bed for weeks in unsanitary conditions that promote infection. They're fed diets that lack essential nutrients needed for recovery and breastfeeding. Any complications that arise are treated with the same ineffective methods used for other conditions, bloodletting, purging, and herbal remedies that often make situations worse. The treatment of childhood diseases reveals the helplessness of medieval medicine when confronted with conditions that are easily treatable today. Children suffering from pneumonia, diarrhea, or other common ailments are subjected to treatments that would be considered torture if applied to adults. They're bled, purged, and given toxic substances while parents watch helplessly as their children suffer and often die. Dental care is primitive and agonizing. Toothaches are treated by pulling teeth with crude pliers, often breaking teeth and leaving infected roots behind. There's no anesthesia for dental procedures, and the instruments used are rarely clean. Many patients die from infections that spread from dental work to other parts of their bodies. The psychological impact of medieval medical care is almost as damaging as the physical effects. People learn to fear physicians and medical procedures almost as much as they fear the diseases themselves. Families often prefer to let sick relatives die naturally, rather than subject them to medical treatments that are more likely to kill than cure. This fear of medicine creates a vicious cycle where people avoid seeking help until their conditions are so advanced that no treatment, regardless of quality, could save them. By the time patients reach physicians, they're often beyond help, reinforcing the perception that most illnesses are fatal and that medical intervention is useless. Now let's examine the legal system of medieval Scotland, because justice in this era bears no resemblance to the concepts of fairness, due process, or equal treatment under law that we take for granted today. The legal system in medieval Scotland is designed primarily to maintain the power structure that keeps nobles in control and peasants in submission. Laws exist not to protect the innocent or punish the guilty based on evidence, but to preserve social order through terror and arbitrary punishment. Justice is administered not by trained judges or juries of peers, but by local lords who have absolute power over the people living on their lands. These nobles have financial incentives to find people guilty because convicted criminals forfeit their property to their accusers. There's no appeal process, no higher court to review decisions, and no protection against corrupt or incompetent officials. The concept of being innocent until proven guilty doesn't exist in medieval Scotland. Accusation alone is often sufficient for punishment, especially when the accused is poor and the accuser is wealthy or powerful. Defendants have no right to legal representation, no right to remain silent, and no protection against self-incrimination. They're expected to prove their innocence rather than having their guilt proven by prosecutors. Evidence in medieval trials consists primarily of testimony from witnesses whose credibility is determined by their social status rather than their truthfulness. The word of a noble carries more weight than that of multiple peasants, regardless of the facts involved. Physical evidence is rarely considered, and scientific investigation doesn't exist. Many legal decisions are made through trial by ordeal, based on the superstitious belief that God will intervene to protect the innocent, while allowing the guilty to suffer. Accused individuals might be forced to carry red-hot iron bars, plunge their hands into boiling water, or be thrown into rivers to see if they float like witches. Survival is sometimes interpreted as evidence of guilt rather than innocence. Trial by combat is another method used to determine guilt or innocence, based on the assumption that God will grant victory to the righteous party. Accused individuals must fight their accusers or appointed champions in battles that often end in death for one or both participants. Physical strength and fighting skill determine legal outcomes rather than facts or evidence. The punishments imposed by medieval Scottish courts are designed to terrorize populations rather than reform criminals or protect society. Public executions are elaborate spectacles where condemned individuals are tortured to death in ways that can take hours to complete. These events are attended by entire communities, including children, as lessons in what happens to those who challenge authority. Hanging is considered a relatively merciful form of execution because death usually occurs within minutes. However, medieval hanging techniques often fail to break the neck cleanly, leaving victims to strangle slowly while crowds watch. Sometimes executioners or family members pull on the victim's legs to speed death and reduce suffering. Drawing and quartering involves tying condemned individuals to 4 horses that are driven in different directions until the body is literally torn apart. This method is reserved for the most serious crimes, particularly treason against nobles or the crown. The victim remains conscious through much of the process, experiencing unimaginable agony before finally dying from blood loss or shock. Burning alive is the punishment for heresy, witchcraft, and other crimes against religious authority. Victims are tied to stakes and surrounded by bundles of wood that are set alight. Death comes slowly from smoke inhalation, heat damage to the lungs, or burning when flames reach the body. Some condemned individuals are strangled before burning begins as an act of mercy, but this kindness isn't guaranteed. Lesser crimes are punished through public humiliation and physical mutilation, designed to mark criminals permanently while serving as warnings to others. Thieves have hands cut off, adulterers are publicly flogged, and perjurers have their tongues cut out. These punishments often lead to death from infection, but that's considered an acceptable risk. The stocks and pillory are used for minor offenses, forcing criminals to stand or sit in uncomfortable positions while community members throw rotten food, stones, and waste at them. Hours of this treatment can cause permanent injury, and some victims die from exposure or injuries inflicted by angry crowds. Branding is used to mark criminals permanently so they can be identified as lawbreakers for the rest of their lives. Hot irons are pressed into flesh, usually on the face or hands, creating scars that never heal completely. Branded individuals find it almost impossible to find work or acceptance in new communities. Imprisonment, when used at all, takes place in conditions that are worse than death for most people. Medieval jails are underground chambers with no light, heat, or sanitation. Prisoners are often chained to walls in spaces so small they can't stand up or lie down comfortably. They're fed spoiled food and contaminated water when they're fed at all. Many prisoners die in jail from disease, starvation, or injuries inflicted by guards who have complete power over their charges. Families of prisoners must pay for their food and other necessities, meaning that poor people simply starve to death while awaiting trial or serving sentences. The treatment of debtors reveals the economic bias of the medieval legal system. People who can't pay their debts can be imprisoned indefinitely, but their incarceration doesn't earn money to pay what they owe. Instead, they become financial burdens on their families while their debts continue to grow through interest and penalties. Women face particular injustices in the medieval legal system. They can't testify in court in many cases, can't own property independently, and are considered the legal property of their fathers or husbands. Crimes against women are often treated as property offences against the men who own them, rather than personal injuries to the victims themselves. Rape is rarely prosecuted successfully because women's testimony is considered unreliable and because the crime is seen as damage to male property rather than violence against individual victims. Women who become pregnant from rape are often punished for adultery while their attackers go free. The legal system's treatment of children reflects their status as property rather than individuals with rights. Parents have absolute authority over their children, including the right to sell them into slavery, abandon them, or kill them if they can't afford to care for them. Child abuse isn't recognized as a crime, and children have no legal recourse against even the most violent treatment. Infanticide is common and rarely prosecuted, especially when the victims are girls or children born outside marriage, unwanted. Babies are often abandoned in forests or thrown into rivers, and mothers who commit these acts face minimal legal consequences because children are considered economic burdens rather than valuable individuals. The corruption of the legal system is systematic and accepted as normal rather than scandalous. Judges routinely accept bribes to influence their decisions. Wealthy defendants can purchase favorable outcomes, while poor ones are condemned regardless of evidence. Legal officials use their positions to enrich themselves at the expense of those seeking justice. This corruption extends to law enforcement, such as it exists. Sheriffs and other officials are appointed based on their loyalty to nobles rather than their qualifications or integrity. They use their authority to shake down merchants, seize property from political enemies, and extract payments from anyone who can afford to pay for protection. The psychological impact of living under such a legal system creates a society where people live in constant fear of arbitrary punishment. Individuals avoid drawing attention to themselves, refrain from reporting crimes they witness, and submit to abuse rather than seeking legal protection that doesn't exist. This fear serves the purposes of those in power by keeping the population docile and submissive. People who know they can be punished without cause or due process are less likely to challenge authority or demand better treatment. The legal system becomes a tool of oppression rather than protection. Let's now explore what passes for entertainment and social life in medieval Scotland, because even leisure activities in this era often involve violence, cruelty, and death. Entertainment in medieval Scotland centers around activities that would be considered barbaric by modern standards. Public executions are major social events that draw crowds from miles around. Families pack meals and make day trips to watch. Criminals being tortured to death, treating these events as combination entertainment and moral instruction for their children. The methods of execution are deliberately drawn out to maximize both suffering and spectacle. Hangings are scheduled for maximum attendance, often on market days when crowds are already gathered. The condemned are paraded through streets before their deaths, with spectators jeering, throwing objects, and celebrating their impending demise. Bear baiting is a popular form of entertainment, where captured bears are chained to posts and attacked by packs of dogs, while crowds cheer and place bets on the outcome. The bears, driven mad by pain and terror, fight desperately against dogs that have been trained specifically for this purpose. The spectacle continues until either the bear dies from its wounds or kills enough dogs to satisfy the crowd. Bull baiting follows similar patterns, with bulls being attacked by dogs or sometimes by humans armed with spears and other weapons. The animals are often partially blinded or crippled before the event to make the contests more exciting for spectators. Victory goes to whoever can inflict the most damage while avoiding being killed by the enraged animals. Cockfighting involves breeding roosters specifically for aggression and fitting them with sharp metal spurs designed to inflict maximum damage on opponents. The birds fight until one is dead or too injured to continue, while spectators gamble on outcomes and cheer for particularly brutal attacks. Human combat sports are equally violent and often fatal. Wrestling matches have no rules against eye gouging, biting, or other tactics that would be considered fouls in modern sports. Boxing involves bare-knuckle fighting that continues until one participant is unconscious or unable to continue fighting. Sword fighting demonstrations and tournaments are theoretically mock combats, but participants often die from their injuries. The weapons used are real and sharp, and the protective armor available is often inadequate to prevent serious wounds. These events are seen as training for actual warfare rather than mere entertainment. Archery contests might seem relatively safe, but they often involve shooting at live targets, prisoners, condemned criminals, or captured enemies who are used as human targets. Contestants compete to see who can inflict the most creative or painful wounds, rather than simply hitting targets accurately. Hunting is a popular pastime among the wealthy, but it often involves cruel practices that maximize suffering for the animals involved. Deer are chased by packs of dogs until they collapse from exhaustion, then torn apart while still alive. Foxes are hunted in similar fashion, with the goal being to terrorize the animals as much as possible before killing them. The treatment of hunting dogs reveals the casual cruelty that characterizes medieval entertainment. Dogs that don't perform adequately are beaten, starved, or killed. Successful hunting dogs are worked until they're injured or worn out, then abandoned to die rather than being cared for in their old age. Religious festivals provide opportunities for different forms of violent entertainment. Mystery plays depicting biblical stories often include graphic torture scenes that are performed with realistic special effects. Actors playing demons torture characters representing sinners, sometimes causing real injuries in their enthusiasm to entertain crowds. Passion plays reenacting the crucifixion of Christ involve actual violence against actors playing Roman soldiers and other villains. These performances can turn into riots where spectators attack performers, leading to serious injuries and sometimes deaths. The line between theatrical performance and actual violence becomes blurred. Dancing, when it occurs, often becomes so frenzied that participants injure themselves or others. Group dances can turn into mass hysteria, where people dance until they collapse from exhaustion or die from heart failure. These events are sometimes attributed to demonic possession, rather than being recognized as dangerous group behavior. Music in medieval Scotland is primarily vocal rather than instrumental, and the songs often celebrate violence, death, and suffering. Ballads tell stories of murders, battles, and tragic deaths in graphic detail. Children learn these songs and sing them as entertainment, becoming desensitized to violence from an early age. Storytelling focuses heavily on tales of violence, supernatural, horror, and moral lessons taught through extreme punishment. Children are told stories about what happens to disobedient offspring. They're eaten by monsters, tortured by demons, or meet other horrible fates. These stories serve as both entertainment and behavioral control. Drinking is one of the few pleasures available to common people, but it often leads to violence, accidents, and death. Ailey and primitive spirits are consumed in large quantities during festivals and celebrations, leading to fights, falls, and other injuries. Alcohol poisoning is common because the strength and purity of drinks can't be controlled with available technology. Gambling provides another form of entertainment, but it often results in violence when disputes arise over outcomes or payments. Dice games, card games, and betting on various contests lead to accusations of cheating that are settled through combat rather than arbitration. Families can lose everything they own in single gambling sessions. Sexual entertainment exists, but is surrounded by shame, violence, and disease. Prostitution is common but dangerous for both providers and clients. Brothels are often controlled by violent criminals who exploit and abuse the women working there. Sexually transmitted diseases spread rapidly through populations that have no understanding of prevention or treatment. The few forms of entertainment that don't involve violence or cruelty are often interrupted by actual violence. Market days, where people gather to trade goods, become opportunities for pickpockets, robbers, and confidence artists. Social gatherings turn violent when personal disputes erupt or when alcohol removes normal inhibitions. Even children's games often involve cruelty to animals or violence toward other children. Young people torture cats, dogs, and other small animals as entertainment. They engage in fights and contests that cause serious injuries. Play activities prepare children for the violent adult world they'll soon enter. The psychological impact of entertainment based on violence and suffering creates a population that becomes desensitized to cruelty and pain. People who watch executions and animal torture as entertainment develop casual attitudes towards suffering that extend to their treatment of family members, neighbors, and anyone else they have power over. This desensitization serves the political purposes of those in power by creating a population that accepts violence as normal and natural. People who are entertained by public torture are less likely to be disturbed by the violence used to maintain social control and political authority. Now, let's examine the role of women in medieval Scotland, because the treatment of half the population reveals some of the deepest brutalities of this society. Women in medieval Scotland are considered property rather than individuals with rights or value independent of their relationships to men. They pass from being owned by their fathers to being owned by their husbands, with no period of independence or self-determination. Their legal status is similar to that of livestock or other valuable possessions that can be bought, sold, or traded. Marriage for women is rarely based on choice, compatibility, or love. Instead, marriages are economic and political arrangements made between men to cement alliances, settle debts, or gain access to land and resources. Girls as young as 12 are married to men they've never met, often men who are decades older and who may already have multiple wives or concubines. The wedding ceremony itself often resembles a property transfer more than a celebration of love. The bride's father literally gives her away to her new husband, transferring ownership along with any dowry payments that have been negotiated. The bride has no say in these arrangements and no right to refuse marriages that have been arranged for her. The wedding night frequently involves what would be considered rape in any modern context. Young girls who have no understanding of sexuality are forced to submit to sexual acts with men they don't know or trust. There's no concept of consent, no consideration of the bride's emotional or physical readiness, and no legal recourse if the husband is violent or abusive. Once married, women lose what little legal identity they might have had as daughters. They don't own property, sign contracts, or make legal decisions without their husband's permission. Any money they earn or inherit becomes their husband's property. They can't leave abusive marriages because they have nowhere to go and no means of supporting themselves. Domestic violence is not only legal, but expected in medieval Scottish marriages. Husbands have the legal right to beat their wives for any perceived disobedience, laziness, or failure to perform their duties. The Church teaches that wives must submit to their husbands in all things, and that resistance to male authority is sinful and deserving of punishment. The violence inflicted on wives often exceeds what would be acceptable treatment of animals. Women are beaten with sticks, whips, and other implements for minor infractions. They're locked in cellars or outbuildings as punishment. They're denied food or other necessities when they displease their husbands. Some are literally worked to death performing household and farm labor. Pregnancy and childbirth represent the most dangerous aspects of women's lives in medieval Scotland. Without understanding of nutrition, prenatal care, or safe delivery practices, pregnancy becomes a prolonged death sentence that kills approximately 1 woman in 10 who attempts it. Those who survive often suffer permanent injuries that affect them for the rest of their lives. The pain of childbirth without anesthesia or effective pain relief is unimaginable to modern women. Labor can last for days, with women screaming in agony while family members and midwives stand by helplessly. When complications arise, as they frequently do, both mother and baby often die in prolonged suffering. The infant mortality rate means that women who survive childbirth often watch helplessly as their children die from diseases, malnutrition, or accidents. The emotional trauma of losing child after child, combined with the physical toll of repeated pregnancies, creates psychological damage that affects women throughout their lives. Women who can't or don't have children face different, but equally severe challenges. They're considered failures as wives and may be abandoned, divorced, or replaced by second wives who can provide heirs. Barren women are sometimes accused of witchcraft or cursed by God, leading to social ostracism or worse. The work expected of women extends far beyond modern concepts of housework. Women are responsible for food production, textile manufacturing, childcare, care of sick family members, and assistance with farm labor. They work from before dawn until after dark, 7 days a week, with no concept of leisure time or personal interests. Food production involves not just cooking, but also growing, harvesting, and preserving everything the family eats. Women tend vegetable gardens, milk cows, churn butter, brew ale, bake bread, and preserve meat through smoking and salting. Any failure in these areas can mean starvation for the entire family. Textile production requires women to raise sheep, shear wool, spin thread, weave cloth, and sew clothing for entire families. This work is done by hand using primitive tools, and the process from sheep to finished garment can take months of constant labor. Women who can't provide adequate clothing for their families face criticism and potential abandonment. Childcare in medieval Scotland involves constant vigilance to keep children alive in an environment that seems designed to kill them. Women must protect children from diseases, accidents, wild animals, and human predators, while also teaching them the skills they'll need to survive into adulthood. Care of sick family members falls entirely on women who have no medical training or effective treatments to offer. They watch helplessly as family members suffer and die from diseases that could be easily treated today. The emotional toll of this responsibility, combined with the constant fear of contagion, creates chronic stress and anxiety. Women's participation in economic activities outside the home is severely limited by legal restrictions and social prejudices. They can't engage in most trades, can't own businesses independently, and can't accumulate wealth in their own names. What little economic activity is available to them is usually extensions of household work, selling surplus food, textiles they've made, or services like wet nursing. The legal system treats women as second-class citizens who can't testify in court in many situations, can't bring legal actions in their own names, and can't defend themselves against accusations. Crimes against women are often treated as property offenses against their male relatives, rather than personal injuries to the victims themselves. Sexual violence against women is common and rarely punished effectively. Rape is seen as damage to male property rather than violence against individual victims. Women who are sexually assaulted often face more punishment than their attackers, especially if pregnancies result from the assaults. The education of women is considered unnecessary and potentially dangerous. Girls aren't taught to read or write because education is thought to make them rebellious and unsuitable for their roles as wives and mothers. The few women who do receive education are usually nuns who have rejected marriage and childbearing. Religious instruction for women focuses heavily on submission, suffering, and the inherent sinfulness of female nature. Women are taught that they're responsible for humanity's fall from grace, that their primary purpose is serving men and bearing children, and that questioning male authority is rebellion against God himself. The treatment of older women reveals the disposable nature of female value in medieval society. Women who can no longer bear children or perform heavy labor are often seen as burdens rather than valuable family members. Elderly women are frequently accused of witchcraft, especially if they possess knowledge of herbal medicine or other skills that make them seem mysterious. Widows face particular challenges in medieval Scottish society. While they may gain some legal independence when their husbands die, they also lose the protection that marriage provided. Widows are often forced to remarry quickly or face destitution. Those who remain single are vulnerable to violence, accusations of impropriety, and social ostracism. The psychological impact of living as property rather than as individuals with inherent worth creates trauma that affects women throughout their lives. They develop learned helplessness, accepting abuse and mistreatment as natural and deserved. The constant fear of violence, pregnancy, and abandonment creates anxiety and depression that pervades every aspect of their existence. This systematic oppression of women serves the broader purposes of maintaining social control in medieval Scotland. A society that treats half its population as property is unlikely to develop concepts of individual rights or equality that might threaten existing power structures. As we near the end of our journey through medieval Scotland, let's examine what death itself looks like in this brutal era, because the way people die reveals perhaps the most fundamental truths about how they lived. Death in medieval Scotland is rarely quick, peaceful, or dignified. Most people die slowly and painfully from diseases that consume them over weeks or months, violence that leaves them bleeding and broken, or starvation that gradually shuts down their body's ability to function. The process of dying often begins long before death itself arrives. People weakened by malnutrition become susceptible to diseases that their bodies can't fight off. Minor injuries become infected and spread poison throughout their systems. Chronic conditions like tuberculosis slowly destroy their lungs while families watch helplessly. There's no effective pain management for dying individuals. People suffering from cancer, advanced infections, or other painful conditions must endure agony,